Okay, there we go. All right, good morning. Thanks again. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm getting you a lot of great. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Adam Parks. I'm a neuropsychologist at KU, and I'm I think approaching my 7th year, which is kind of crazy to say out loud. But so neuropsychology. I'll talk about what neuropsychology is. Some of you may be familiar with the kind of work that we do, but basically we just look at a person's thinking skills. That's kind of what it's just a fancy word for someone who measures and assesses and helps people understand their thinking skills, and usually in the context of a neurological condition. And so the one that's probably most relevant to the folks that are here today would be a stroke. We see a lot of folks that have had a stroke. Sometimes we see folks that are, many years ago, what typically work, at least our clinic does typically work with patients who are in the more sort of subacute, sort of 3 to 6 month. Usually that's more with them reserved for, say, rehabilitation specialists and that kind of thing. But we do tend to see folks who maybe had sort of in the past, and then they've made some kind of recovery, and then years later they're noticing maybe some additional problems. So we try to see everyone we can understand, help them understand their thinking skills in all contexts. And so hopefully there's something in this talk here today, which I'll be going over kind of the brain. I usually like to nerd out about the brain and talk more specifically about different areas of cognition. Again, cognition is sort of a fancy word for our thinking skills, and not just memory, but also attention skills and what we can do in our everyday lives to help out our thinking skills. So, let's get into it already.
Okay.
All right. Oh, geez, well, technology. Great. Okay. I already know that. So I always like to start off with just giving you a little tour of the brain. So welcome to your brain. This really is, it's not something we tend to really think about unless the philosophers in the audience here, what our brain really is. It is the source for every single thought, plan, action, desire, fear, emotion. Everything we ever experience in our entire lives all takes place just right up here. And yeah, there's the world around us, and we can interact with other brains floating around out there, right? But for the most part, everything that we've ever known takes place just right up here. And our interactions with the world around us is interpretations of what's going on right up here. And so when we really consider how important the brain is, well, what is the brain itself? It weighs about 2.5 to 3 pounds. It's about 1/3 of a gallon in volume. So if you got a gallon in bulk, cut that into thirds, that's how big it is. And really, well, the brain is 3/4 water. That's all it is. It's just a bunch of water, and mostly the tissue that's made up of is fat. There's lipids or fats as a tissue. And so what I think is a crazy statistic is, although the brain represents only about 2% of your total body weight, it utilizes 15% of the blood supply and about 1/5 of the oxygen. So I don't think I have to.
That one thing.
I can just talk loudly, but I don't want the people on the. Are they able to hear me?
They can hear you really loud.
Okay. I'll try to speak. Is that better or worse?
Better.
Better. Oh, we're back. Maybe it was just a connection problem. So the brain it just loves oxygen, it loves nutrients and energy. So sugar is the primary source of energy for the brain, and all of that is supplied by blood. And so blood is extremely important to the brain. If there's ever a cutoff of the supply to the brain and blood, and that's when we get a stroke. And so we have to don't have to say that more than once. The brain cells run neurons, so everyone's probably heard that term before. There's 100 billion neurons in the brain. And every single one of those neurons is connected to hundreds of other neurons. So there's trillions of connections in the brain. It's unfathomable to think about that. In the way that medicine and science has divided the brain, is we try to go in and sort of understand the architecture and the geography inside the brain. And I'll go over briefly just some general terms. And I do this because either yourself or your loved one who is affected by stroke maybe has heard some of these terms before in the context of the location of the stroke in the brain. And so I like to go over the regions in the brain. The brain is also surrounded by a very thin layer of cells along the outside typically, and those are really important cells because that's called the cortex. And underneath the cortex are other important structures called the subcortex. And there's different, most of those sort of higher level cognitive abilities that I'm going to talk about take place in the cortex. And so it's a very, very small portion of the brain. That's also the difference between gray matter and white matter. Again, using these terms, because some of you may have heard of your doctors or your medical providers talk about these terms. But the gray matter is usually the cortex. There's also gray matter areas in the subcortex. But the white matter is actually much more intriguing to me because those are the connections between the different cortical areas and cortex areas of the brain. So it's like the wires running between, connecting, the communication of. So sometimes when we talk about subcortical stroke or subcortical white matter disease, usually that's when those wires are a little less efficient in communicating information to the different parts of the brain. And then the geography that I mentioned earlier is important. There are major areas called lobes in the brain, so I'll go over those here. So this is obviously a drawing of someone's brain, and we're looking at sort of the left side left profile. So if I sort of stick my head just like that, that's what we're looking at. And the frontal lobe is the easiest one to remember what that is. It's front, what that means. The temporal lobe is sort of on the side here. So you can sort of take your hand and go like that, that's the frontal lobe. If you take your hand and go like this along your ear, that's the temporal lobe. And the back is the occipital lobe. And sort of the crown of your head is the parietal. I'll talk about those two here in just a second. So the frontal lobe is the largest lobe in the brain. It's also the most complicated. It's where the most complex thinking skills take place. So sometimes they're called executive function, but they're things like problem solving, judgment and reasoning, planning and organizing, and then some other cognitive abilities as well too, like attention and concentration, being able to produce speech, motivation, impulse control, emotion regulation as well too. And I know I'm primarily talking about cognitive, so memory, attention, that kind of thing, but our emotional functioning is intertwined with our cognitive abilities. So, I mean, who here would say that when they feel kind of stressed or overwhelmed, they think a lot more clearly? I don't feel that way, and I bet most of you would agree. If you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed, you probably think less clearly and you feel more, to use an extremely technical medical term, discombobulated, right? We'll talk more about what stress does to the brain later on, how that's to manage stress as well too. So that was the frontal lobe, again, most complex, the largest, the most energy intensive, and also it involves pretty much every cognitive ability in some form or fashion. The temporal lobe is also pretty important because it really, that's where learning and memory primarily takes place. So the short-term memory loss, remembering a conversation you had with somebody at breakfast, we had this kind of short-term memory is typically thought of as being temporal lobes. But also important in the temporal lobes is language processing. And so we have two temporal lobes, one on each side, and one is typically more language focused, where one is more visual focused when it comes to memory. Emotion processing is also important in the temporal lobe because of its connections to the frontal lobe. And then auditory sensation, because again, the temporal lobe is on the over the ears, the primary auditory cortex is right. The parietal lobe is that one that's up here at the top. This is mostly involving sensation and perception of sort of bodily movements and spatial orientation, so trying to move where you're at that 3D space, and also language comprehension as well too, because of its proximity to the temple. In fact, this area right here, where the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and occipital lobe all mix, it's called the temporal parietal occipital junction, and it's a really important connection area in the brain. And then lastly, the occipital lobe. This one's kind of a conundrum to me because I think it's interesting. Visual processing, how we see the world around us, processed in the back of the brain. And if we didn't really know this beforehand, you thought, okay, well, our eyeballs in the front part of the brain. Where is the visual information in our brain's process? It actually goes in through our eyeballs, focuses over, and shoots to the back of the brain. So it's almost like this it's very counterintuitive to think of where and where visual information is. But again, all of these different areas of the brain, these lobes of the brain, are important to understand because there is an injury or disease that affects that part of the brain, then we can understand a person's symptoms. Is anybody, either themselves or a loved one, have experience with problems with the occipital lobe or the visual processing in context of a stroke? Yeah, it's not uncommon. And earlier, so I talked about the cortex being the outer layer. The inner layer is the subcortex. This is just an additional, don't worry, this will all be on the quiz later, so I will solve those terms. But again, so we have like the basal ganglia, that's really important in motor, fine motor skills and motor regulation. We have the amygdala, which is important in motion processing. The thalamus, they call it the sensory relay station. It's where all our senses go through and out of the thalamus. The thalamic strokes are unfortunately pretty common. The cerebellum is this sort of little bump that's hanging out below the brain. Neuropsychologists don't really give the cerebellum a lot of credit because it's not super involved in cognitive abilities, but it's also really important in things like balance and motor coordination too. So I think it deserves a little more credit. And there's another depiction of that gray matter, white matter distinction. So again, gray matter is a very thin strip. And I think it's even thinner than this image here. The white matter is much more, makes up a larger percentage of the gray. So this, I think this is an artist condition, but we do actually have in our clinical capacity to measure the connections. This is measuring different connections between the brain. And we do so by seeing how water travels along the neurons in the brain. And while it may not be to this extent, we do have functional MRI technology to be able to take pictures like this in patients' brains. So typically this kind of imaging is done, and I'm sorry, I probably should have introduced this. This is just like that image from before with the brain. The temporal lobe is right there, so we're looking at the profile. But this is just a very simplistic, I know this is not a good thing. But I mentioned earlier there's trillions of connections. This is just showing some major connections in different parts of the brain. So we do have the technology to do this kind of imaging. And then, of course, I have to mention the blood flow, the vascular system of the brain, again, extremely important. We have a lot of connections between getting blood up into the brain, and once the blood is up to the brain, it sort of circulates and goes out into the tissue, and then it's brought up by the venous system and circulates to the rest of the body. So again, very important to get blood to the parts of the brain. All right. So that was the tour of the brain. It's a lot quicker than you might get into, say, an anatomy class or something like that. But I usually like to set the stage of that information. So now to talk about neuropsychology, and again, it's the difference between, say, a neurologist or a psychologist, psychiatrist, is we like to combine those two things together. And so we try to understand symptoms from neurological and neurosurgical conditions and how they vary widely in a person's courses, their medical history, what kind of treatment they may either have gotten or potentially could get in the future. And then, of course, what is the level of severity that they're experiencing? Some people have more mild symptoms, whereas the symptoms may be more significant. It used to be that, and I can't remember if I have a slide on history of neuropsychology, I think I do, so I'll try to go that. But some of the major symptoms that a neuropsychologist might see in our clinic, talk about with patients, and also test for tests are things like speech and language changes, memory problems, attention and concentration, visual, spatial difficulties, problems with judging and reasoning, those executive functions, like I mentioned before, and then of course emotional changes or emotion regulation problems that also do as well. So neuropsychology is a very young field. Really started hitting its upward trajectory probably in the 80s and 90s. But before technology existed, like CT scans, CAT scans, and MRIs, neuropsychologists were there performing the tests, trying to figure out where in the brain the stroke was, the injury was. And so it's funny, you probably go back and read commentary from neuropsychologists when the first MRI started to be introduced. And they said, oh no, we're going to be out of the job. And we're not going to be useful anymore. But thankfully, neuropsychologists adapted. You're also going to be standing here today. So now we are much more concerned about, well, let's use our tools that we've developed, our tests, to better understand person's symptoms, but more importantly, in my opinion, how those symptoms interfere with or make a person have trouble with their day-to-day lives. I can give a person 1,000 tests and get a bunch of scores on the page, but those scores don't mean anything if I can't translate that into how does that impact a person's ability to just get around day to day and go to the store and do the things that they want to be able to do in their lives. So that functioning really becomes much more important when we interpret our test scores. So just real briefly, I don't have to go into this too much, but neuropsychologists and doctoral clinicians who have expertise in brain-behavior relationships. That's a term that neuropsychologists love to say, brain-behavior relationships. So we test the cognitive and emotional abilities. Education is really important, both for patients, their family members, their caregivers, and then also the treatment of emotional symptoms and cognitive deficits. By training, we're psychologists, but I think more in the context of neuropsychology, we might talk about cognitive rehabilitation or cognitive therapy and the treatment of those symptoms. And again, the functional impact of the condition of the injury, that's really the most important aspect of our job. So the testing itself, I've been talking about test itself, and so I'll briefly go over what that looks like. And again, it's measuring those symptoms that I mentioned earlier. So attention, concentration, processing speed, memory and learning, language, visual processing, executive functions, emotional behavior. There's some other aspects in there as well too that I didn't necessarily list, but it's those are the major hit points when it comes to neuropsychological testing. This is what it might look like if you go into an examination or an evaluation. You'll sit across the table from the examiner. They might use a clipboard or some paper. It's still a little bit old-fashioned. Most of this stuff, pencil and paper. You might be asked a question, and typically it's not like, it's not like you're given an ink wad and you say, "What do you see in this picture?" That we won't use that test, but it's more like I'm going to say a word that I want you to remember, or I want you to give you a list of numbers that I want you to remember. It's cognitive performance type of testing. I think also why neuropsychological testing and neuropsychological evaluations are special is that the types of tests that we use are specifically designed to be able to control for things like age, education, and so when I talk to patients and say, I'm going to test your memory skills, but don't worry, I'm going to compare your memory to other people that are your same age or your same level of education. So they don't have to worry about the comparison at this point. They can say, well, I wouldn't be very me if I had to take that test. If we compare it to something at this point. So I'll get into a little bit more specific. The most common symptoms that we see when we do neuropsychological testing typically involve memory and attention. And so that is why I will focus on those two main areas of cognition. If I went through that entire list of symptoms that I mentioned earlier, we could be here all day. So when I talk about attention, what I mean is concentration, focus, being able to hold your attention to a TV show or a book, someone is talking at an lecture. Well, sometimes provide auditory and visual attention. So being able to pay attention to something you're hearing versus being able to pay attention to something you're seeing. Shifting attention. So being able to focus on more than one thing at a time. And then I also like to mention this myth of multitasking. And who here would say that they either are or have been a very good multitasker? It's definitely a point of pride, and some people really excel at it. The point you're actually not really doing is you're not being able to do more than one thing at one time. What you're actually good at is you're being able to shift your attention back and forth between one thing to another. And yeah, you might need to be able to juggle multiple balls, but unfortunately, sometimes when you think you're doing this, you might end up actually like this. That's me in my office. So what I like to say in response to folks that tell me, oh, I have trouble with multitasking, I want to say, well, maybe you're just trying to juggle two balls. So focus on fewer and fewer things to focus on, prioritize, and then that shifting back and forth, which can sometimes be kind of problematic, this is feeling a stroke, becomes a lot easier. Sustaining attention, so not just focusing on something for a short amount of time, being able to focus on something for a long period of time. And then when it comes to attention, well, problems with attention might arise when we talk about distractions. So distractions are frustrating because if you throw you off what you're doing and being able to find your way back to what you're doing after you deal with the distraction, that happens a lot in the clinical space as well. We might be working on one thing, you have to jump to something else. So that would be an external distraction, something came into the environment to break your attention. But maybe even more common than external distractions are internal distractions. So working on something, thought pops in your head, I need to go do that. So then you sort of break what you were doing, you walk over, you whatever it was, and then you don't remember to go back to what you were doing before. That's an internal distraction that broke your concentration from what you were doing before. So I actually think that's a much more common and also much harder to manage or deal with, because our thoughts are thoughts. They pop into our head without our control necessarily. And then memory, I'll sort of go through this a little bit quicker than I typically do, but mostly, I mean, memory is, everyone has a memory, ability to take in information, hold on to it, and then use that information later on. So the most basic understanding of what memory is. When we talk about the neuropsychology of the brain, we tend to break it up between short-term and long-term memory. The short-term being more in that sort of minutes to hours versus long-term in more days to weeks to years. And this is pretty jargon heavy, so I apologize, but there's really two main types of memory. And this is really important because different parts of the brain control these different types of memory. So the term episodic memory, which comes from the word episode, is really what is happening to us day to day. So it's what we had for breakfast this morning. It's a conversation we had earlier today. That's an episode in time, and that's we're conscious of that happening. So it's a conscious recollection of something that's happened to us. Procedural memory for procedures, memory for procedures, is things that we remember how to do because we've done them a million times. We remember how to tie your shoe, ride a bike, brush your teeth, that kind of thing. So those are more procedures that have become more ingrained because of our remembering them over time. And again, there's different parts of the brain that control these different memories. So there's a few parts of the memory process that I'll like to touch upon briefly. And the first is getting the information into our brains and minds to begin with. So we don't always think about that when it comes to memory. Usually it's, I'm trying to remember something from the past. But we don't ever really think about what was happening in the past when we first were exposed to that information. And so attention in that moment, the very beginning of the process of memory, is really important. Because let's face it, if you're not paying attention to something in the first place, you're not going to remember it later on, because it never got in the first place. So attention is really essential when we talk about the registering or the recording of the information in our minds. When we move a little bit further down the line in the memory process, we talk about short-term memory. So this is more, complex attention skills or there's a term called rehearsal, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. Maybe I'll touch upon here later, but rehearsal, we've all done some of these to some extent throughout our lives. And these are, I know we just have names for it. So rehearsal is if someone tells you something, you're going to say it to yourself. Maybe once, maybe twice, you're going to say it over and over again. And that rehearsing to yourself enhances your ability to remember it later on. So if someone tells you a phone number, or someone tells you your name for the first time, and you rehearse it in your mind, you're more likely to remember it if you haven't rehearsed it in the first place. If we stick with the phone number example, chunking is a term for combining like information into larger pieces of information, because we're more likely to remember smaller quantities of information if there's. Let me just give that. Let me go straight to that phone number example. What is a typical phone number? Got here 7 digits, right? If I were to say 7 numbers to you in a row, you'd have probably a hard time remembering. But thankfully, whenever they invented the phone numbers, they put a little dash or hyphen between the third or fourth number. So now instead of trying to remember 7 pieces of information, you really just have 2 pieces of information, a 3-digit number and a 4-digit number. And so we're much more likely to remember that information because it was chunked into 2 larger chunks. But you can do this, right? You can do this for a story that someone's telling you. You can sort of combine like information together. You can do this for your names. There's a lot of different applications for chunking, right? Never going to go around this one too. Mnemonic, something you probably use a lot in school, but maybe not as much later on. But this is developing a memory strategy to remember something later on. So taking the first letter of a word, maybe the planets, the solar system, or a math process, and take the first letter, and you remember those letters. It helps you remember that process later on. And so you can use mnemonics throughout your life. Even if you're out of school now, you can still go back and use mnemonics. And talk about that again. Now, associations is a little bit more nuanced because that really is getting at what all of that other stuff is doing, and that is forming connections between information. And our brains are really good at understanding associations. And so if you're trying to remember something, if you can associate that information to something else, then if you're trying to remember one of those pieces of information, you're more likely to remember it because they're associated. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you meet somebody new, and you really want to remember their name. So let's say, hi, Mr. Brown. And sure enough, Mr. Brown has a brown shirt on. So if you try to remember Brown with a shirt, you connect those 2 pieces of information, which might have been completely irrelevant otherwise. Now that you form that connection and association with the information, you're much more likely to remember it later on. And this is infinitely applicable. You can do that with anything in life that you're trying to remember. create associations, create connections between. And then, as I kind of alluded to earlier, your emotional state that you're in when you're trying to remember the information, it's really important that you have to pull it out later. There's actually been research to suggest that the emotional state that you're in when you try to learn something, if you're in that same emotional state later on, you're more likely to remember that information. And that can be good and bad. So if you're really calm, not a lot of stress, not a lot of distraction going on, you're in a pretty happy state, and you learn something, try to pull it out later. If you're again calm, happy, content state later on, you're more likely to pull it out. But let's say you're overwhelmed, stressed, in either of those instances, you'd have to be stressed and overwhelmed again to be able to pull that information out again. So our emotional state that we're in when we're trying to remember information is really important. And then finally, the long-term aspect here, sometimes we call retrieval. We're retrieving that information from our brains, from our minds, can be helped by cues. So let's say a hint, right? So you're not quite being told what the information is. So for Mr. Brown, it was his first name starts with the letter B. Oh, I have Brown. That's a cue. And we create cues throughout our everyday life without even realizing it. We might put a cue down on a piece of paper. We might have someone say, hey, remind me of this later on, so that they might give you a cue. And so cueing is very helpful for retrieval part of the memory. Again, the emotional state is important that you're in. And then repetition kind of sounds like a person. But what I actually mean by this is that the more that a person retrieves a memory, that is, you're remembering something, remembering it over and over, the more that you're repeating that to yourself. Again, this is something that you learned earlier, the more likely you are to remember it. So if I'm really trying to remember, say, boundaries, maybe I'm trying to remember boundaries. I can reverse it 50 times right when I did that, right when I learned the boundaries, right? But let's say over the next few weeks, I'm asked my address every day, right? I quiz myself almost. That repetition, doing that every single day, makes it much more likely to remember my address than I would have if I hadn't done that. So it's kind of one of those things. The more you remember something, the more likely you are to remember it later. So here's some strategies for attention. Kind of already talked about this a little bit. So how do you keep yourself from getting distracted by things in your environment? Well, remove those distractions from the environment. It may sound a little simplistic, but sometimes that might be removing the distraction itself, or sometimes that might be removing yourself from the distraction. And so this has become much more challenging with technology, because let's face it, we have things that can beat and vibrate and try to get our attention as much as possible. But thankfully, that technology has evolved to a point where there's ways that you can set your phone to, turn off notifications at certain points of the day, or you could put it on silent so that it doesn't be fetched all the time. So there's ways that you can work around those distractions that were really developed in the first place to get your attention. Planning is really important for attention. So sometimes we don't always put those things together, but let's say we have to tackle a project at home or some kind of task, unfortunately, might be paperwork related. Well, let's say you plan ahead of time. You say, okay, during this amount of time, we're going to plan to do this task. And that way you can make sure that you're not going to be distracted. So if there are other people that are around you, that's your time to be focused to attend. Maybe to go somewhere, either it's just another room in the house or go somewhere else to be able to focus. So if you're planning ahead of time, not only is it probably going to help out with your motivation, but it's also going to be helpful for your ability to focus. Here's another one that's a little counterintuitive. How do I focus on something for a really long time? Well, take breaks from focusing on it. It's one of those things where you're work really hard on focusing and then actually take a planned break. It could just be 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But really, if you break up a very long or very complex project into smaller pieces by taking breaks, you're more likely to complete that whole project. So again, like, let's say you're filling out some paperwork or something, and you got all this stack in front of you. If you think, okay, I'm just gonna work for 15 minutes and take a break, 15 minutes, you're more likely to be able to achieve that goal because you're not getting fatigued or burning out because of how long you're just focusing that whole time. And as I mentioned before, break up those larger projects into smaller, more manageable tasks. So what are some strategies for memory? I've already kind of talked about a lot of these. So what are those encoding strategies, the reporting strategies, rehearsal and repetition, chunking, mnemonics? Again, very straightforward strategy here, but write it down. And why I like to mention this too is not just because, well, yeah, write it down for later, but the actual act of writing something down enhances the encoding. It enhances your recording of that information in your mind. Therefore, later on, you're more likely to remember it. Has anybody ever written down a note to yourself to remember to do something or to remember important information, and later on when you needed that information, you remembered it, you didn't even need to go back to the note? Has that ever happened before? Everyone will probably see this happen. Well, because you wrote down the information, let's say you tried to remember it without writing it down. Well, not only are you not going to be able to go back to it later on, but because you didn't write it down to begin with, that's where your memory sort of quote unquote failed. So writing down is important for both trying to initially learn or record the information. It's also really helpful when you need to back and reference later. And then again, pretty self-explanatory when it comes to, well, what if I need to remember something in the future? Again, write it down. Write down your appointments, use a day planner or a calendar. I used to think this was sort of universally held and pretty common until I really started working with folks a lot of folks out there, and you don't have to show hands or anything, but I never really used a calendar or planner. I didn't really need that at all to get their jobs or their day-to-day life. So the introduction of that strategy was actually quite challenging because they were trying to learn that habit or learn that skill later on. Now, of course, we have electronic calendars now and things on our phones and our computers. I still would be a fan of just pencil and paper or pen and paper. But what I about that one, everyone's at the batteries, right? Your notepads can still be there. It doesn't update on you overnight. Look totally different the next morning. Does anybody ever have their phones do that? Right? It's just like, where does everything now? It's all moved around. Now your notepad is, I promise, not going to change. And then it's nice to just have one single piece of or one system. So I'll talk to some patients who say, oh yeah, I use a calendar. I've got a desk calendar. I've got a wall calendar. I've got a pocket book. I've got my phone. And I said, well, let's simplify it. Just use one system. And I think that the pocket planner, the one that's more portable is really nice because you can take it with you to the doctor's office. You can take it with you to where you need to go. And then again, this is sort of when technology gets reintroduced into the equation when we use alerts and reminders, set reminders to your phone, alarms, that kind of thing. Those can usually come in pretty handy. Unfortunately, our little paper notepad is not going to do that usually if it's still you need to take your medication. And as I mentioned before with the cues, it's nice to have maybe don't go overboard, but maybe a sticky note or something that sort of cues your reminder of what's going on. So you're sort of going throughout your day-to-day life and you need to remember something. If you put a note to yourself in maybe by the front door, on the refrigerator, somewhere that you're going to see it, those visual cues can help jog your memory and help you retrieve that important information you need to remember. Okay. So the last section I'll talk about, and I'll try to go a little quicker here, are what are some tips that just everybody can do to improve their cognitive health. And this is extremely important for persons who have had a brain condition like a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, or they have a degenerative disease like Alzheimer's. But this is also important for anybody else that has a brain and wants to improve their cognitive health. So here are some general tips. And most of this is going to be pretty familiar because it's things our doctors have been telling us about for years, but it really is extremely important and crucial. And the best part is these are tips that you can start doing today. These are not things you have to worry about, getting a prescription for or having to take phone calls about. These are things you can literally start doing after you leave today. So, what's really cool is a lot of these tips, a lot of these strategies help the brain through a process of what's called plasticity. And so it used to be that we thought that our brains would sort of grew and develop, and after a certain point in time, our brains never really changed. After we reached adulthood, we just stayed the same and we didn't really develop anymore. But what we're learning is that throughout our entire lives, our brains are able to adapt and learn new processes through a process of plasticity. And where have we learned that the most? Rehabilitation. Think about it. The rehabilitation process wouldn't work if we didn't have brain plasticity. So it's really an exciting thing to think about, that our brains can actually adapt and improve and evolve throughout our lives. So these positive health behaviors can help improve cognition and prevent decline. Physical exercise, really big surprise there. Exercising is extremely helpful for our bodies. It's also extremely helpful for our brain. So in addition to helping out the cardiovascular system, our respiratory system, as I mentioned before, the brain is just a glutton for energy and blood and oxygen. And so the more that we can improve our body's ability to send oxygenated blood and energy and nutrients to our brain, the better. And so that's why exercise is extremely important. There's also some much more complex things like neurotransmitter and chemical production in the brain that I will get into, but exercise is extremely important in those systems as well too. In addition to physical exercise, there's this idea of cognitive exercise or cognitive stimulation, as some kind of call it. And this has been shown to be related to positive outcomes in the brain. Just like if you talked about muscle and body, the brain is kind of a muscle in and of itself. So if you don't use it, you might lose it. I like to say this often, is that our brains crave novelty. No matter how young or old you are, our brains love novelty, whether we realize it or not. And so what do I mean? When we talk about stimulation, this is not necessarily something that may be done your whole life. It's maybe seeking out something new that could be stimulating to your mind. So if you like games, puzzles, computer games, things like that, yeah, those can be helpful. But what's actually more important is that those are sort of new each time. So if you need to go out and run out and purchase one of those brain game subscriptions, they're probably, unless it's really something you're into, I say go with that. What's nice about those is they update pretty frequently and new games to play, new ways of stimulating the brain. But what I think is probably more accessible to most folks is starting a hobby or a skill that you already have. So who out there would be comfortable sharing a hobby? What do you like to do? I'm not the only one that doesn't do. Any crafters out there?
No, I love gardening.
Garden?
But also just the game that's do go.
Games, yeah. So puzzles are great because you can start with Sudoku, and I think there's obviously you can increase your skill or your difficulty level in those specific puzzles. But what if you branched out to a different kind of puzzle, a different word puzzle, and kind of push that boundary of what you're comfortable with and try to find it. There's thousands of versions of numbers of word puzzles out there. So that's that novelty piece of it.
Yeah, so Jason likes to play those computer games.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, those games are great because I wouldn't say upgrade, but you can change the task itself. Not only can you improve the difficulty or increase the difficulty of those games, but you can try a different game that's totally new to you. Never been exposed to that performance, that novelty that. Sometimes I'll have patients tell me, "Oh, I really like to do this kind of sewing technique cross culture," and I say, "Well, why don't you try a different type of sewing technique? Maybe one you're not really very familiar with." So you're still doing the skill or you really enjoy, but you're branching outside of your comfort zone and pushing that boundary of novelty. And that's really what stimulation is supposed to work. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, so social activity is also really important. So participating in a discussion group, support group, is very helpful. Or even doing what you're doing right now, attending a presentation or lecture at the community center or college. So different ways that we can all get cognitive stimulation. And then, as I alluded to earlier as well, too, cognitive rehabilitation is sort of the medical application of cognitive stimulation and that term plasticity that I mentioned earlier. All right, so then, of course, when I talk about exercise, we have to talk about diet. But I don't like that term diet. It's such a negative, we have such a negative connotation. If I said the word diet, you probably all sort of quote that. So I like the term dietary lifestyle. It's a much more pleasant term. So the healthy dietary lifestyle not only improves our bodies, but also our minds. Balanced meal, balanced variety, mostly fresh foods is really important when it comes to our cognition as we get older. The Mediterranean diet is pretty popular. When we first started doing this talk, that's popular. I think everybody here has probably heard of the Mediterranean diet. The problem is it's a little vague. A lot of different versions of what it is. Can we have this? Can we not have that? This fish count, this poultry count, kind of that's sort of how do I put myself in the mind of the person who lives to the Mediterranean and see that kind of thing. So what I actually did is some researchers out of the University of Chicago came up with an enhanced version of the Mediterranean diet by combining with the DASH diet. So a lot of us have probably heard of the DASH diet from the American Heart Association, and they call it the MIND diet. And what's nice is the MIND diet has been specifically designed for and researched in patients who have people who have cognitive changes. I think they mostly looked at people who have had Alzheimer's disease, but I think they've also expanded out into other areas of stroke. So the MIND diet is nice because it's a little bit more, I mean, it's kind of a good and bad thing. It's a little bit more prescriptive in what it tells you should have or shouldn't have. But what's nice is that at least gives you some direction, gives you some guidance in what. And so there's high consumption foods, vegetables, fruits, berries, nuts, seeds, grains, moderate consumption, fish, poultry, olive oil, alcohol, and low consumption red meat and sweets and pastries. I could maybe do my sweet diet or something at the very top. Sleep, so incredibly important, and a lot of us have had a relationship with sleep over our lives, but there's actually behaviors that we can do every single night to help improve our sleep quality. And this is just like we have a nighttime hygiene routine when it comes to getting ready for bed, but we also can have a sleep hygiene routine. So what does that look like? Of course, maintain a regular routine. So that means going to bed and waking up at the same time every single day, even on the weekends. What I would say is create a sleep cave. What does a typical cave look like? It's usually cold, dark, and quiet. So you can make your bedroom those three things, you're more likely to sleep. Avoid naps during the day. I know it's really challenging. Oftentimes you don't get great sleep quality at night. You're not getting good sleep. If you don't get good sleep at night, you're probably going to have to sleep during the day tonight. If you can, as much as possible, though, avoid those naps. You can maybe rest for a little bit of time, maybe take a 20-minute power nap. But again, sleeping on and off throughout the day is not generally good for healthy things. Use your bed for sleep only. The asterisk there is sleep set, but the bed is really important. It's good for sleep because we don't want to be doing other behaviors in bed like reading, watching television. I know that it tends to come in the territory of the bedroom, but if you only use your bed for sleep, that means your body and your mind will be trained to sleep in bed. And that kind of goes to the next point, that if you're not able to fall asleep in say the first 10 or 15 minutes, actually get out of bed. Because you don't want to train your body and mind to be awake in bed, you want to train it to be asleep in bed. So if you get out of bed, go do some kind of boring, maybe read a magazine or a history book or something, unless you like history, then that wouldn't be boring at all. But the main idea there is go do something that's not very stimulating, then crawl back into bed and fall asleep. But again, it seems kind of counterintuitive to say, well, you can't fall asleep and wake up again, but it actually isn't shown to work.
avoid caffeine and alcohol, nicotine, blue light, exercise before, and a few hours before bedtime. And then, try to go quickly here, stress and image, talk about stress a little bit here. Of course, it has a negative impact on our bodies, it also has a negative impact on our environments. Not only can it impact our heart and cardiovascular issues, it can also impact what might lead to a stroke or contribute to stroke, so blood pressure, heart rate, and sleep. I didn't mention this before, but if there's concern about problems with breathing and sleep, then there might be the necessity to obtain what's called a sleep study. And they actually, you can do them at home now. You can necessarily have to go into a sleep lab, because that's what your doctor wants. But sleep and cardiovascular health is really important to get sleep apnea. If we're even just a little bit concerned about the presence of sleep apnea, that is a really strong risk factor for stroke that we want to address as well as possible. So, what do we do with stress? Well, stress is always going to be there. Things that cause stress are always going to be there. We can't really necessarily get rid of all of it. So, what do? We can address how we react to the stress itself. And there's ways that we can make it less likely that the stress is going to have you cross that threshold into feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed out. Pick a better term than that. Simply just doing some deep breathing, some relaxation techniques can be helpful. So this is what we call belly breathing. Actually, when we're babies, we breathe through our bellies all the time. As we get older, for some reason, we start to breathe through our chest. And so you can actually test it, putting your hands up, one hand on your belly, one hand on your chest. You take a deep breath, whichever one does more, tells you which one you do. So there's different exercises out there that can help you practice your breathing. And I've actually been seeing more popularity in mainstream for something called breath work. That's actually, because this is stuff I've been talking for years, that psychologists have been talking about that stress reduction through breathing exercises is really effective. And the best part is it's free, right? You have to go buy something to help with your breathing, do it automatically every day. It's just the kind of breathing really important. There's more complex relaxation techniques, what's called progressive muscle relaxation. So there's tensing and relaxing different muscle groups in the body. And there's, if you want to follow some kind of guide, there's YouTube videos out there to walk through it. Something called mindfulness. And so mindfulness is in terms of becoming much more popular in the mainstream, but that is being in the present moment, being attentive to what's happening here and now. We have a really easy tendency to worry about something happening in the past or think about something that's coming in the future, but mindfulness is this idea of really trying to bring our attention to the present moment. And I really like this picture because the first picture here is mindful, where the dog is mindful. He's just thinking about what's in the present there. And again, there's more complex relaxation techniques like mindfulness that is meditation. But sometimes when I say with meditation, people think, oh, I have to go find a beach somewhere and do this. So I just want to meditate. Well, you can actually do this anytime, anywhere. It's on a chair or a pillow on the ground, and you can walk yourself through the meditation practice. All right, so let me just wrap up here. More than happy to take any questions as well. So again, changes that we're going to do to a neurological illness like stroke can have a significant positive impact on a person's cognition, including their attention skills or their memory skills. Neuropsychologists, I think, are really well equipped to assess and better understand an individual, a single patient's specific difficulties and help best guide how to alleviate it, how to at least possibly compensate for it if it is very necessary. Despite that, I think you don't have to have any contact with a psychologist. You would do a lot of those helpful brain activities or tips that I mentioned from before. There's things that you can do, actions you can do every single day that promote cognitive and brain health and protect their brains against decline. And then, of course, I'll leave with this, whatever is good for the heart is good for the brain. So if you're ever in doubt, if you just think about it, this is probably good for my heart, then it'll definitely be good. Thank you all very much.